Hello there, and welcome to Earth's history, where the past unfolds like water flowing through ancient riverbeds, where deserts remember when they were gardens, and where the sand beneath our feet whispers stories of a time when it was mud, rich and fertile, teeming with life. Tonight, we're traveling to a place you know, but to a time when you wouldn't recognize it. We're going to the Sahara, that vast ocean of sand that stretches across North Africa, that endless expanse of dunes and rock and emptiness. But we're not going to the Sahara as it is today. We're going back to a time when the Sahara was green. If you've ever looked at a map of Africa and seen that enormous band of desert stretching from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, if you've ever wondered what it would be like to walk for days without seeing a tree or a river or anything alive, you're about to discover something extraordinary. Because the Sahara wasn't always a desert. Just a few thousand years ago, it was covered in grasslands and lakes, in rivers and forests, in animals and people living lives we can barely imagine. This is the story of the African humid period, of the Green Sahara, of a time so recent in Earth's history that it feels like yesterday, and yet so different from today that it seems like another world entirely. Wherever you are right now, I hope you're comfortable, settled, ready to journey into a past that is both ancient and surprisingly close. Maybe you're lying in bed as the night deepens around you. Maybe you're sitting quietly as the world outside grows still. Maybe you're in that gentle space between waking and dreaming, where time softens and the mind can wander freely across landscapes that no longer exist. If this journey into a vanished world brings you peace, if it helps you see how quickly and profoundly places can change, I'd be grateful if you'd like the video, subscribe to the channel, or share it with someone else who finds comfort in these slow explorations of Earth's memory. So settle in. Let your breathing slow like wind across a peaceful lake. Let your thoughts drift like clouds over green hills. And let's begin. Because roughly 11,000 years ago, when the last ice age was ending, when glaciers were retreating across Europe and North America, something remarkable was happening in North Africa. The rains were returning, the desert was turning green, and for 6,000 years, the Sahara would be a place of abundance, a place where life flourished, where humans and animals thrived, where lakes stretched to the horizon and rivers flowed year-round. And then, slowly, inevitably, it ended. The rains failed, the lakes dried, the green faded to brown, and brown to gold, and gold to the pale yellow of sand, and the desert we know today emerged, burying beneath its dunes the memory of what had been. Part 1. The desert. Today, before we step into the Green Sahara, before we watch the rains return and the land transform, we need to understand what the Sahara is today, what it has been for the past few thousand years, what most people think of when they hear the word Sahara. Because the contrast, the difference between then and now, is so profound that you need to feel the emptiness of the present to appreciate the abundance of the past. The Sahara today is the largest hot desert in the world, covering roughly 9 million square kilometers, an area about the size of the United States or China. It stretches across North Africa, from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Red Sea in the east, from the Mediterranean Sea in the north to the Sahel, the semi-arid transition zone, in the south. It spans multiple countries: Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan. Vast, empty, inhospitable. The word Sahara comes from the Arabic word for desert, Sahara, so calling it the Sahara Desert is technically redundant, like saying desert. But the name fits. The Sahara is desert in its purest form, in its most extreme expression. It's a place where life is sparse, where water is scarce, where survival requires adaptation and endurance beyond what most organisms can muster. The landscape of the modern Sahara is varied, but uniformly harsh. There are ergs, vast seas of sand dunes that roll like frozen waves to the horizon, dunes that can reach heights of 180 meters, that shift and move with the wind, burying anything in their path. The sand is fine, almost powdery, ground down over millions of years from ancient rock, sorted by wind until only the smallest grains remain. Walking on these dunes is exhausting, your feet sinking with each step. The sand hot enough during the day to burn exposed skin. There are regs, vast gravel plains covered in small stones, the remnants of ancient weathered rock, stretching flat and featureless for hundreds of kilometers. The stones are often desert varnished, coated with a thin layer of manganese and iron oxides that gives them a dark, almost black surface, polished by wind-blown sand. Walking across a reg is easier than crossing dune, but the monotony is crushing, the landscape unchanging, the horizon always distant. There are hamadas, rocky plateaus of exposed bedrock, often limestone or sandstone, carved by ancient rivers into canyons and gorges that are now dry, empty, silent. These plateaus can rise hundreds of meters above the surrounding lowland, their edges steep and forbidding. In some places, the rock has been sculpted by wind into strange formation, arches and pillars, and balanced rocks that seem to defy gravity. And scattered throughout the desert are mountain, isolated massifs rising abruptly from the plain, volcanic peaks, and uplifted blocks of ancient crust. The Tibesti Mountains in Chad, the Ahagar Mountains in Algeria, the Air Mountains in Niger. These ranges are islands of higher elevation, slightly cooler, slightly wetter, places where a few hardy plants can survive, where desert-adapted animals find refuge. But mostly, the Sahara is flat, empty, and dry. Rainfall is minimal, often less than 25 millimeters per year in the core regions, sometimes with years passing between rain events. When rain does fall, it often evaporates before reaching the ground, or it runs off quickly without soaking into the hard-baked earth. There are no permanent rivers in the interior of the Sahara, only wadis, dry riverbeds that fill briefly during rare storms and then dry up again, leaving no trace except the scoured channels carved into rock and sand. Temperatures are extreme. During the day, especially in summer, ground temperatures can exceed 70 degrees Celsius, hot enough to fry an egg on a rock, hot enough to kill any unprotected organism within hours. The air temperature might reach 50 degrees Celsius or higher in the shade, though shade is rare. But at night, the temperature plunges, sometimes dropping below freezing in winter, because the dry air traps no heat, allows the ground to radiate warmth rapidly into space. The temperature swing from day to night can be 40 degrees Celsius or more. Vegetation is sparse, limited to areas where groundwater reaches the surface or where rare rains provide temporary moisture. There are oases, places where underground aquifers come close enough to the surface that wells can be dug, where date palms and acacias can grow, where small communities can survive. These oases are lifelines, strung like beads along ancient trade routes, separated by hundreds of kilometers of emptiness. In the hyper-arid core of the Sahara, plants are virtually absent. Years can pass without rain, and nothing grows. The ground is sterile, bare rock or bare sand, baked and lifeless. But in the slightly less arid margin, in the transition zone, there are patches of hardy vegetation, grasses that grow quickly after rain and then die, leaving seeds to wait for the next shower. Shrubs with deep taproots reaching down meters to find water. Succulents that store moisture in thick leaves or stems. Animal life is equally sparse, but remarkably adapted. There are fennec foxes, tiny desert foxes with enormous ears that help dissipate heat, that hunt at night and shelter during the day in burrows. There are addax, desert antelopes with broad hooves for walking on sand that can go weeks without drinking, extracting moisture from the plants they eat. There are desert monitors, large lizards, and various species of snakes and scorpions. There are birds, ravens, and sand grouse that fly long distances to find water. But compared to other ecosystems, the Sahara is nearly empty. The biomass, the total weight of living things per unit area, is among the lowest on Earth. There are places in the Sahara where you could walk for days without seeing another living creature larger than an insect, where the only sounds are the wind and the shifting of sand. And yet, scattered across this barren landscape, there are signs of a different past: rock art, paintings, and carvings on cliff faces, and boulders depicting animals that no longer live in the Sahara: giraffes, elephants, hippos, crocodiles, cattle. These images are thousands of years old, created by people who lived when the Sahara was green, when these animals roamed where now there is only sand. There are ancient lake beds, vast depressions in the desert floor that were once filled with water, now dry, their surfaces cracked and crusted with salt. Some of these lake beds are enormous, larger than many modern lakes, their ancient shorelines still visible as faint lines etched in the landscape, terraces marking where water once lapped against rock. There are fossilized trees, petrified wood lying on the surface, the remains of forests that grew when rain was abundant. The wood has turned to stone over thousands of years, mineralized, preserved, a testament to a time when trees could grow where now nothing does. And there are archaeological sites, the remains of settlements, stone circles, and hearths, and tool scatters, evidence of human occupation, of communities that lived and thrived and then moved away or died out when the climate changed, when the desert returned. All of this is evidence, silent testimony, written in rock and bone and artifact, that the Sahara was not always as it is now, that it has known other states, other climates, other ecosystems, and the most recent of these green periods, the one we're exploring tonight, ended only about 5,000 years ago. Just 5,000 years, which is nothing in geological terms, barely a heartbeat, but long enough that it seems like ancient history to us, long enough that the memory has faded, except in art and archaeology and the stories we tell. Part 2. The rhythm of change. To understand why the Sahara turned green, why it turned back to desert, we need to understand the forces that control rainfall in North Africa, the mechanisms that bring moisture or withhold it, the rhythms that operate on timescales of thousands of years, too slow for any human to perceive directly, but fast enough to transform landscapes within the span of a civilization. The climate of any region is controlled by many factors: the position of continents, the circulation of the ocean, the composition of the atmosphere, the output of the sun. But in North Africa, the dominant factor controlling rainfall is the position of the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or ITCZ, and the strength of the African monsoon. The ITCZ is a belt of low pressure that circles the Earth near the equator, where the trade winds from the northern and southern hemispheres meet and converge. This convergence causes air to rise, and as it rises, it cools, and as it cools, moisture condenses, forming clouds and rain. The ITCZ is why the tropics are wet, why rainforests grow near the equator, why some places receive rain almost every day. But the ITCZ is not stationary. It moves north and south with the season, following the sun. In northern hemisphere summer, when the sun is directly over the Tropic of Cancer, the ITCZ moves north, bringing rain to regions that are dry during winter. In northern hemisphere winter, when the sun is over the Tropic of Capricorn, the ITCZ moves south, and those same regions dry out. This seasonal movement of the ITCZ drives the monsoons, seasonal wind patterns that bring rain to large parts of Africa and Asia. In summer, the ITCZ moves north, and with it comes the African monsoon, winds laden with moisture from the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, bringing rain to the Sahel, to West Africa, to parts of East Africa. In winter, the ITCZ retreats south, the monsoon fails, and these regions dry out. But the position of the ITCZ and the strength of the monsoon aren't constant over longer timescales. They vary in response to changes in Earth's orbit, changes that affect how much sunlight different parts of the planet receive at different times of year. These orbital changes operate on cycles of tens of thousands of years, and they're driven by gravitational interactions between Earth and the other planets, primarily Jupiter and Saturn. There are three main orbital cycles, known as Milankovitch cycles, after the Serbian scientist Milutin Milankovic, who first calculated them in the early 20th century. The first is eccentricity, the shape of Earth's orbit, which varies from nearly circular to slightly elliptical and back over about 100,000 years. The second is obliquity, the tilt of Earth's axis, which varies between about 22.1 and 24.5 degrees over about 41,000 years. The third is precession, the direction that Earth's axis points, which changes over about 26,000 years, causing the seasons to shift relative to Earth's position in its orbit. These changes are small, but their effects on climate can be profound because they alter the seasonal distribution of sunlight, changing how much solar radiation different latitudes receive in different seasons. And it's these seasonal changes that matter most for the monsoon. During the last ice age, which ended about 11,700 years ago, Earth's orbit was such that northern hemisphere summers received less sunlight than they do today. The ITCZ didn't move as far north. The African monsoon was weaker, and North Africa was dry, locked in the grip of desert conditions even more extreme than today. The Sahara was vast, barren, hostile, probably even larger than it is now, extending farther south, reaching almost to the equator in some regions. But as the Ice Age ended, as the great ice sheets covering Europe and North America began to melt, Earth's orbital configuration was changing. By about 11,000 years ago, the northern hemisphere was tilted more toward the sun during summer than it is today, receiving more solar radiation, experiencing hotter summers. This intensified the temperature contrast between land and ocean, strengthening the monsoon, pulling the ITCZ farther north than it reaches in the modern climate. The effect was dramatic. Regions that had been desert for tens of thousands of years began to receive summer rainfall. Not just a little rain, but substantial precipitation, perhaps 200 to 400 millimeters per year, or more in areas that today receive almost nothing. This is still not a lot by temperate or tropical standards, but it's enough. Enough for grass to grow, enough for shrubs, and even trees to take root, enough for rivers to flow and lakes to fill, and animals to migrate northward into territory that had been uninhabitable. This shift happened relatively quickly, geologically speaking. Within a few centuries, perhaps as little as 100 years, the vegetation began to change, the landscape to transform. The desert didn't disappear all at once, didn't turn into a rainforest overnight, but it greened, it softened, it became livable. And it stayed that way for about 6,000 years, from roughly 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, a period that geologists and climatologists call the African humid period, or sometimes the Holocene climatic optimum in North Africa, though optimum is a human-centric term, implying that wet is better than dry, which depends on your perspective. For those 6,000 years, the Sahara was a different place. Not lush everywhere, not uniformly green, but a complex mosaic of grasslands and savannas, of lakes and rivers and wetlands, of scattered woodlands in the highlands, of desert still in the driest cores but much reduced, pushed back, confined to smaller areas. It was a landscape that could support large populations of animals and eventually substantial numbers of humans. And then, about 5,000 years ago, it began to change again. Earth's orbit continued its slow cycle. Northern Hemisphere summers began to receive less solar radiation. The monsoon weakened. The ITCZ didn't push as far north. The rains became less reliable, less abundant. Some years they came, some years they didn't. Lakes began to shrink, their edges retreating, exposing mudflats that dried and cracked in the sun. Rivers flowed less reliably, sometimes full, sometimes reduced to chains of pools, sometimes dry. Vegetation began to die back. The grasses turning brown, the trees struggling, the landscape fragmenting into patches of green, separated by growing expanses of bare ground. The transition from green to desert happened faster than the transition from desert to green. Within perhaps 1,000 years, certainly no more than 2,000 years, the Sahara had returned to desert conditions. The lakes had dried, the rivers had ceased to flow, the animals and humans had moved away or died. The desert reasserted itself, the sand returned, the wind scoured the land, and the green Sahara was buried, preserved only in the sediments of dry lake beds, in rock art on cliff faces, in the memories and stories of the people who had lived through the transition. This wasn't the first time this had happened. The Sahara has oscillated between green and desert many times, paced by the Milankovitch cycles, by the changes in Earth's orbit, and the resulting shifts in monsoon strength. During every interglacial period, the warm phases between ice ages, the monsoon has strengthened, and the Sahara has greened. During every glacial period, the monsoon has weakened, and the Sahara has expanded. This has been going on for millions of years, a rhythm as regular as the tides, though operating on timescales of tens of thousands of years rather than hours. But the most recent greening, the one from $11,000 to 5,000 years ago, is special to us because it's the one we know the most about, the one that left the clearest evidence, the one that humans witnessed and recorded in their art and archaeology. And it's special because it was the last one, the most recent, and because we're now living in a time when the Sahara is desert, when it's hard to imagine it being anything else, when the idea of a green Sahara seems almost fictional, almost impossible. But it happened, and it will happen again. In another 10,000 or 15,000 years, when Earth's orbit brings northern hemisphere summers back into a configuration that strengthens the monsoon, the rains will return, the Sahara will green again, the cycle will repeat. Unless human activity has so altered the climate system that these natural cycles are disrupted, which is a very real possibility, but that's a topic for another time. Part 3. The greening begins. Let's step into that moment of transition, that shift from desert to green, and watch it unfold. Imagine yourself standing in what is now the Central Sahara, perhaps in what is now northern Chad or southern Libya, roughly 11,000 years ago. The Ice Age has just ended. The great glaciers to the north have been melting for a few centuries. The world is warming. And here, in the heart of the desert, change is coming. The ground beneath your feet is sand and gravel, hard-packed, wind-scoured, almost devoid of vegetation. Scattered shrubs cling to life in the wadi, the dry riverbeds, their roots reaching deep to find moisture. But mostly it's empty. The sun beats down relentlessly. The temperature during the day is punishing. At night, It's cold, the desert radiating away its heat into the clear sky. But something is different this year. The summer has been unusually cool near the ground, unusually warm in the upper atmosphere, creating instability, convection. Clouds have been forming more frequently, towering cumulus that rise into the sky like white mountain. And one afternoon, as the heat builds and the air rises, one of these clouds grows dark, its base turning gray-black, and rain begins to fall. Not much at first, just a few drops, fat and warm, spattering on the hot ground and evaporating instantly in puffs of steam. But then more, a proper shower. Rain falling in sheets, soaking into the sand, pooling in depression, running in tiny rivulets toward the wadis. The smell is extraordinary, that distinctive petrichor, the scent of rain on dry earth, geosmin released by bacteria, waking after long dormancy. A smell that speaks of life, of possibility. The rain lasts perhaps 20 minutes, perhaps an hour, and then it's over. The cloud dissipating, the sun breaking through again. But the ground is wet, not just damp, but soaked. Water standing in puddles, mud forming where before there was only dust. And in that mud, things are stirring. Seeds that have lain dormant for years, perhaps decades, absorb water, begin to germinate. Within days, tiny green shoots push through the soil, their first leaves unfurling, racing to grow and photosynthesize and produce more seeds before the inevitable dry period return. These are ephemeral, plants adapted to brief windows of opportunity, capable of completing their entire life cycle in weeks. Insects emerge from underground burrows, from beneath rock, drawn by the moisture, by the sudden abundance of plant matter. Beetles, ants, grasshoppers, their populations exploding in response to the rain, and predators follow, spiders and scorpions, lizards and small mammals, taking advantage of the temporary bounty. But this rain is not an isolated event. The next week, another storm rolls through, and the week after that, another. The summer monsoon has arrived, not strong yet, not reliable, but present, bringing moisture where for millennia there had been only drought. And with each rain, the transformation accelerates. The ephemerals spread, carpeting the ground in green. Perennial grasses take root, their deeper roots allowing them to survive longer between rain. Shrubs that had been barely clinging to life in the wadi send out new growth, their branches thicken, their leaves expanding. By the end of that first wet summer, the landscape has changed noticeably. Not lush, not forest, but no longer barren. There are patches of grass, scattered shrubs, a softness to the terrain that wasn't there before. And when the dry season comes, when the monsoon retreats south and the rains stop, much of the vegetation dies back, but not all. Some survive, dormant, waiting, and the next summer, when the rains return, they're a bit stronger, a bit more reliable, and the greening continues. This pattern repeats for decades, for centuries. Wet summer, dry winter, the vegetation gradually establishing itself, spreading, diversifying. The grass cover becomes denser, forming continuous swards in some areas, rather than scattered clumps. Trees begin to appear, first in the wadis, where water collects, then spreading onto the plain, where the water table has risen, close enough to the surface that deep roots can reach it, and water accumulates on the surface. The wadis, which had been dry for thousands of years, begin to flow again, not constantly at first, but seasonally, filling during the summer rain, becoming streams and rivers, cutting deeper channels, eroding the bank. Water that once would have evaporated or soaked into the sand now flows downhill, gathering in the in the ancient lake basin that had been dry for so long. The first lakes form in the deepest depression, fed by the rivers, by groundwater seeping up from below, by direct rainfall. They're shallow at first, seasonal perhaps, filling during the wet season and shrinking or drying during the dry season. But as the years pass, as the aquifers recharge, as the water table rises, the lakes become more permanent, deeper, larger. Within a few centuries, there are substantial lakes dotting the landscape. Lake Megachad, in what is now the Chad Basin, grows to enormous size, covering over 400,000 square kilometers, larger than the Caspian Sea is today, comparable in size to the current Mediterranean Sea. Its waters are fresh, fed by rivers flowing from the highlands to the south and east, by the Chari River and others, their flow much greater than the trickle they carry today. Other lakes form in Libya, in Algeria, in Mauritania. These lakes are connected by rivers, by seasonal streams, creating a network of waterways across what is now desert. Fish colonize these waters, migrating up from the Nile, from the Niger, from refugia where they had survived the dry period. Crocodiles and hippos follow, moving into the lake, establishing population, thriving in the abundant water. The vegetation around these lakes is richest, densest, approaching woodland or even forest in some areas. Acacias and tamarisks grow along the shores, their roots in the water or close to it. Grasses and sedges form dense stands in the shallows. Reeds grow tall, creating reed beds that provide habitat for water birds, for fish, for amphibians, and the animals come, not all at once, but gradually, migrating north from the savannas to the south, following the rain, following the vegetation, following the water. Gazelles and antelope grazing the grassland, elephants browsing the shrubs and trees, giraffes reaching high into the acacias, cattle, wild aurochs moving in herds, lions and hyenas and leopards, predators following the prey, ostriches and bustards, large ground birds, countless smaller animals, rodents and hares and foxes. The Sahara, or what would become the Sahara when the rains failed, is transformed into a vast savanna, a grassland dotted with trees, interspersed with lakes and rivers, supporting an abundance of life comparable to the modern Serengeti or the Okavango Delta. It's not uniform, not everywhere the same. The northern edges are drier, more desert-like, the vegetation sparser. The southern edges, where the monsoon brings more rain, are wetter, more vegetated, transitioning into the dense savannas of the Sahel. The highland, the Tibesti, and Ahagar Mountains are cooler, wetter, supporting different plant communities, perhaps montane forests in the wettest areas, but across vast swaths of what is now empty desert, there is life, movement, sound, color. The wind carries the scent of grass and water, the calls of birds, the grunts of hippos, the roar of lion. The sky is often cloudy during summer, the rains falling. Regularly, the landscape responding with growth. In winter, the sky clears, the temperature's moderate, the grass dries but remains, providing food for grazers. The cycle repeats year after year, stable, sustainable, a functioning ecosystem. And into this green Sahara, humans arrive. Part 4. The people of the Green Sahara. Humans have lived in North Africa for hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps longer. Homo sapiens originated in Africa, possibly in East Africa, and spread across the continent and beyond. But during the Ice Age, during the long dry period that preceded the African humid period, the Sahara was a barrier, a vast, inhospitable expanse that was difficult or impossible to cross. Human populations were confined to the margins, to the Nile Valley, to the coasts, to the Sahel, to the highlands, places where water was available year-round. But when the Sahara greened, when the lakes filled, and the rivers flowed, it became habitable, even attractive, and humans moved in, following the animals, following the water, exploring this newly accessible territory, establishing themselves in what had been empty desert. The earliest evidence of human occupation in the Green Sahara dates to shortly after the onset of the African humid period, around 10,000 to 9,000 years ago. Archaeological sites from this period are found scattered across what is now desert, near the ancient lake shores, along the fossil river valley, in the rock shelter of the highland. These sites contain stone tools, hearth, animal bones, and, most remarkably, art. The rock art of the Sahara is one of the richest collections in the world. Thousands of sites, tens of thousands of individual images, painted or carved onto rock face, boulders, cave walls. The art spans thousands of years, from the early Green Sahara through the transition to desert, documenting the changing environment, the changing human culture, the changing relationships between people and animal and land. The earliest phase of Saharan rock art, sometimes called the wild fauna or Bouboline period, named after a species of extinct buffalo often depicted, dates to roughly 10,000 to 6,000 years ago. The images from this period show the animals that lived in the Green Sahara: elephants, rhinos, hippos, giraffes, buffalo, various antelope species, ostriches, crocodile. These are not domestic animals. They're wild, depicted realistically, often in scenes that suggest hunting or observation. The people who created this art were hunter-gatherers, living off the abundant wildlife, fishing in the lakes and rivers, gathering wild plants. They were mobile, moving seasonally to follow the animal, to exploit different resources at different times of year. But they kept returning to certain places, certain rock shelter or outcrops near water sources, and over generations, they built up layers of occupation, layers of art, creating sites that were clearly important, perhaps sacred, perhaps simply practical as gathering places. The style of this early art is often naturalistic, the animals depicted with attention to detail, to anatomy, to posture. Some images are just outline, simple line drawings. Others are filled in with color, using red and yellow ochre, white kaolin, black charcoal, or manganese oxide. The artists ground these minerals into powder, mixed them with water or animal fat to make paint, and applied them with fingers, with brushes made from plant fibers, with tools we can only guess at. Some of the images are enormous, several meters tall, dominating cliff faces. Others are small, clustered together in complex compositions. Some show single animals, standing or walking. Others show herds, groups of animals moving across the rock surface. And some show humans, tiny stick figures compared to the animals, suggesting the scale, the power, the importance of the wildlife in the lives of the people. Standing in front of one of these rock art sites, perhaps in the Tassili Niger Plateau in Algeria, or the Caucasus Mountains in Libya, you would be struck by the vividness, the immediacy of the images. These are not abstract symbols, they're representation, attempts to capture the appearance and character of the animals that shared the landscape. And they speak across millennia, connecting you to the artist who stood in the same place, who looked out over a green landscape, who saw elephants grazing and hippos wallowing and giraffes browsing, and who felt compelled to record what they saw, to leave a mark, to say, we were here, this is what we saw, this is what mattered to us. As the Green Sahara persisted, as generations passed, human societies changed, adapted, developed new technologies and new ways of living. Around 7,000 to 6,000 years ago, a dramatic shift occurred. The adoption of pastoralism, the herding of domestic animals, particularly cattle. Cattle were probably domesticated somewhere in North Africa or the Near East around 10,000 years ago, and they spread into the Green Sahara during this middle period. For humans, this was transformative. Domestic cattle provided a reliable source of food, milk, and meat, and could be managed, moved, bred selectively. Pastoralism allowed people to exploit the grasslands more efficiently than hunting wild game, to support larger populations, to establish more permanent settlements near reliable water sources. The rock art changes during this period, entering what's called the pastoral, or cattle period, lasting from roughly 6,000 to 4,000 years ago. Now the images are dominated by cattle, enormous herds depicted in meticulous detail. Individual animals are shown with distinctive coat patterns, horns of different shapes, sometimes with brands or marking. The cattle are clearly important, valued, central to the culture. Human figures become more common and more detailed in the pastoral art. They're shown herding cattle, milking them, leading them to water. They're shown wearing elaborate clothing and jewelry, carrying bows and arrows, dancing, engaging in what seem to be ritual activities. The art becomes more complex, more narrative, telling stories rather than just depicting animals. Settlements from this period show evidence of semi-permanent occupation. Stone structures, corrals for cattle, storage pits, graves. People were still mobile, moving seasonally with their herds to find fresh pasture and water. But they were also establishing base camps, places they returned to regularly, places where they buried their dead and stored supplies and created community. The pastoral peoples of the Green Sahara developed sophisticated cultures. They made pottery, some of the earliest pottery in Africa, decorated with complex geometric patterns, and sometimes with images of animals and humans. They made elaborate tools from stone and bone. They created beads and ornaments from shell, stone, and ostrich eggshell. They engaged in long-distance trade, exchanging goods across hundreds of kilometers, connecting communities across the vast grassland, and they thrived. For 1,000 years or more, the pastoral period represents what seems to have been a stable, successful adaptation to the Green Sahara. Population densities were probably low by modern standards, but the region supported substantial numbers of people and their herd, living in balance with the environment, managing their animals, moving with the season, maintaining their cultures and traditions. But the environment was changing. The monsoon was weakening. The rains were becoming less reliable, and slowly, inexorably, the Green Sahara was beginning to fade. Part 5. The drying. The transition from green to desert wasn't uniform, wasn't smooth. It happened in pulses, in stages, with periods of rapid change interspersed with periods of relative stability, with local variation, with some regions drying faster than others. But the overall trend was clear and irreversible. The Sahara was returning to desert. The first signs appeared around 6,000 years, perhaps earlier in some regions. The summer rains became less reliable, some years bringing abundant moisture, other years bringing drought. Lakes began to fluctuate more dramatically in level, their shorelines advancing and retreating, exposing mudflats during dry year, flooding them again during wet year. Rivers flowed less consistently, their channels sometimes full, sometimes reduced to chains of pools, sometimes completely dry. The vegetation responded to these changes. The grasses, which had formed continuous cover during the wettest period, began to thin out, leaving patches of bare ground. Trees that had grown in areas now receiving less rainfall died, their stumps and branches littering the landscape, slowly weathering, eventually being buried by wind-blown sand. The most drought-sensitive species disappeared first, followed gradually by the more tolerant as the drying continued. Animals responded by moving, by migrating southward to regions where rainfall was still adequate, or by concentrating around the remaining water sources, the lakes and rivers that still had water, even during dry years. But as those water sources shrank, as the lakes dried and the rivers ceased to flow, the carrying capacity of the land decreased. There simply wasn't enough water, enough vegetation, to support the same numbers of animals that had thrived during the wettest centuries. Some species disappeared from the region entirely. Hippos, which require permanent deep water and abundant vegetation, were among the first to go, retreating southward to the Niger and the Nile, unable to survive in the shrinking lake. Elephants followed, their enormous appetite for vegetation and water making them vulnerable to the drying. Rhinos, giraffes, buffalo, one by one, the large megafauna retreated or died out, leaving behind only their bones, scattered across the landscape, slowly fossilizing in the dry condition. The human populations faced the same pressures. As the grasslands dried, as the lakes shrank, as the wild game became scarce, the pastoral peoples had to make difficult choices. They could intensify their herding, concentrate their cattle around the remaining water sources, but this led to overgrazing, to degradation of the vegetation, to conflict with other groups competing for the same resources. They could move, following the rains southward, abandoning the sites that had been occupied for generations, leaving behind their rock art, their settlement, their dead. And many did move. The archaeological record shows a clear pattern of abandonment, of sites that had been occupied for centuries suddenly being left empty, of populations shifting southward into the Sahel, into the Nile Valley, into regions where the monsoon still brought adequate rainfall. This wasn't a single mass migration, but a gradual process, spread over centuries, with different groups moving at different times, some staying longer than others, some attempting to adapt to the worsening conditions before finally giving up. The rock art from this late period, from roughly 4,000 to 3,000 years ago, reflects the changing condition. The images of cattle become less common. Horses appear, introduced from the north, better adapted to drier conditions than cattle, faster, requiring less water. Camels appear in the latest art, the ultimate desert-adapted animal, capable of going days without water, surviving on the sparsest vegetation. The shift from cattle to horses to camels in the art mirrors, the shift from grassland to semi-desert to full desert in the environment. Human figures in the late art are sometimes shown in scenes that suggest desperation, conflict, crisis. There are images of people gathering around drying water sources, images of what might be warfare or raiding, images that convey a sense of stress, of a society under pressure. The art itself becomes less elaborate, less carefully executed, perhaps reflecting a population struggling to survive with less time and energy for creating complex works. By about 5,000 years ago, around 3000 BCE, the drying had reached a critical threshold. Lake Megachad, that enormous inland sea that had covered hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, shrank rapidly, its level dropping by tens of meters, its area reduced to a fraction of its former extent. The rivers feeding it had dried up or reduced to seasonal flows. The lake fragmented into separate smaller lakes, and eventually even those shrank to small remnants, leaving behind vast dried lake beds, salt flats, and desert. Other lakes across the Sahara followed similar trajectories. Some dried completely, leaving no trace except the ancient shorelines and the sediments deposited when they had been full. Others persisted as small remnant lakes, fed by groundwater or by rare floods, but they were tiny compared to their former extent, incapable of supporting the ecosystems that had flourished around them. The rivers stopped flowing. The wadis, which had carried water seasonally, if not year-round, became dry gullies, their beds baked hard, their banks eroding slowly in the wind. The water table dropped as the aquifers, no longer recharged by abundant rainfall, slowly drained, their water emerging at springs and seeps that gradually dried up, and the desert advanced. Sand, which had been stabilized by vegetation during the green period, was now exposed as the plants died. Wind picked up the sand, carried it, deposited it in dunes. These dunes began to move, to migrate, to bury the remnants of the green period, covering the lake beds, the river channels, the archaeological sites, the rock art in some cases, creating the landscape of sand and rock that characterizes the Sahara today. By 4,000 years ago, by 2000 BCE, the transformation was largely complete. The Sahara had returned to desert condition, perhaps even more arid than it is today in some regions. The grasslands were gone, replaced by scattered drought-adapted shrubs. The lakes were gone, replaced by dry basin. The rivers were gone, replaced by fossil valley. The animals were gone, retreated to regions where water still flowed. And most of the humans were gone too, having moved away to more hospitable regions. But not all humans left. Some adapted, finding ways to survive in the desert as it formed around them. They concentrated in the oases, in the few places where groundwater still reached the surface, where date palms could grow, where small-scale agriculture was possible. They learned to use camels, which arrived in North Africa from the Arabian Peninsula around 2,000 years ago. Animals perfectly adapted to desert travel, capable of carrying goods and people across vast, waterless expanses. These desert-adapted people became the ancestors of the modern Tuareg, the Bedouin, the other nomadic groups that have lived in the Sahara for millennia, that have developed cultures and technologies specifically adapted to desert survival. They're not trying to recreate the Green Sahara, not trying to farm or herd large cattle herds in conditions that won't support them. Instead, they've learned to work with the desert, to find water where it exists, to move constantly, to travel light, to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The drying of the Sahara had consequences far beyond the region itself. The movement of populations southward, the displacement of pastoral and hunter-gatherer people, contributed to cultural changes, to the development of new societies and states. Some researchers believe that the drying of the Sahara contributed to the rise of ancient Egypt, as populations concentrated in the Nile Valley, the one place in North Africa where water was still abundant, where agriculture could be practiced reliably. The Nile, fed by rains in the East African highlands far to the south, continued to flow even as the Sahara dried, creating a narrow ribbon of fertility through the desert, an oasis thousands of kilometers long. People fleeing the drying Sahara brought with them their knowledge of agriculture, of animal husbandry, of pottery, and tool-making, and this contributed to the development of one of the world's great civilizations along the Nile's bank. Similarly, the drying may have contributed to developments in West Africa, as populations concentrated in the Sahel and farther south, leading to increased population density, to the development of agriculture, to the rise of complex society. The environmental crisis of the drying Sahara was, in some ways, a catalyst for cultural change, forcing people to adapt, to innovate, to develop new ways of organizing society. But it also represented a loss, a closing off of territory that had been habitable, a reduction in the resources available to humans and animals. The Green Sahara had supported substantial population, had been a corridor for movement between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, had been home to rich ecosystems. Its transformation into desert meant that territory was lost, that connectivity was reduced, that the Sahara became a barrier rather than a bridge. Part 6. The evidence remains. How do we know all this? How do we know the Sahara was green? That it supported lakes and rivers and abundant wildlife? We weren't there. There are no written records from the Green Sahara, no historians chronicling the changes. The people who lived through it left no text, no detailed account. Yet we can reconstruct the story with remarkable confidence, with detail that would have been impossible just a few decades ago, because the evidence is everywhere, written in the landscape, preserved in the sediment, recorded in the art and archaeology. The first and most obvious evidence is the rock art we've discussed, those thousands of images showing animals that don't live in the Sahara today, showing pastoral scenes, showing boats and fish and crocodiles in regions that are now hundreds of kilometers from any permanent water. The art is a direct record, a snapshot of what people saw, what mattered to them, what the environment was like. But beyond the art, there are multiple lines of physical evidence, each telling part of the story, each confirming and complementing the others. There are the fossil lake beds, the ancient shoreline, across the Sahara, in places like the Chad Basin, the Fezzan in Libya, the basins of Mauritania and Algeria. There are vast depressions, lowlands that show clear evidence of having been filled with water. The ancient shorelines are visible as terraces, as lines of beach sediment marking former water level, sometimes dozens of meters above the current basin floor. These shorelines can be traced for hundreds of kilometers, forming closed contours around the basin, proving that these were lakes, not rivers or temporary floods. The sediments in these basins tell even more detailed stories. When scientists drill cores from the dried lake beds, they retrieve vertical sequences of sediment that represent time, with the oldest sediments at the bottom and the youngest at the top. These sediments contain evidence of the environment when they were deposited. Sediments deposited in lakes are typically fine-grained, clays and silts that settled slowly from the water column. They're often laminated, showing seasonal layers, light and dark bands representing wet and dry season, or productive and less productive period. They contain microfossils, the remains of diatom, and other microscopic algae that lived in the lake water. Species that tell us about the water chemistry, the depth, the temperature. The sediments also contain pollen, microscopic grains released by plants, that are preserved in the lake sediment and can be identified to genus or even species. By analyzing the pollen in sediment cores, scientists can reconstruct the vegetation around the lake at different times. Pollen from grasses indicates grassland. Pollen from trees indicates woodland. Pollen from desert shrubs indicates arid condition. By tracking how the pollen assemblage changes through time, moving up the core, scientists can watch the vegetation chain, can see the greening, and then the drying recorded in precise chronological sequence. Some sediments contain macrofossils, larger remains like seed, leaves, wood fragment, insect parts, fish bone, mollusk shells. Each of these tells something about the environment. Seeds and wood can be radiocarbon dated, providing precise ages. Fish bones tell us what species lived in the lake. Mollusk shells tell us about the water chemistry and can also be dated. The sediments also contain chemical signatures that reflect climate. The ratio of different oxygen isotopes in carbonate minerals or in mollusk shells reflects the temperature and the source of the water. The ratio of carbon isotopes reflects the type of vegetation in the watershed, whether it was grassland or forest or desert. The ratio of hydrogen isotopes in leaf waxes preserved in the sediment reflects rainfall amount. All of these geochemical proxies can be measured, providing quantitative estimates of temperature, rainfall, vegetation type, complementing the qualitative information from fossils and pollen. And the sediments can be dated. Radiocarbon dating works on organic material up to about 50,000 years old, covering the entire Green Sahara period. Other methods, like optically stimulated luminescence, can date the sediments themselves by measuring when sand grains were last exposed to sunlight before being buried. By dating sediments at different depths in the core, scientists can construct age models, can assign ages to the entire sequence, can say exactly when the lake was deep or shallow, when vegetation was abundant or sparse, when the climate was wet or dry. When cores from multiple lakes are analyzed and dated, they show a consistent pattern, a wet period from about 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, with the wettest conditions around 9,000 to 6,000 years ago, then a drying trend accelerating around 5,500 years ago and reaching full desert conditions by about 4,000 years ago. The timing varies slightly from region to region, with the northern Sahara drying earlier and faster than the southern Sahara, but the overall pattern is clear and consistent. There are also geomorphological features, landforms created by water that are now high and dry in the desert. Fossil river channel, ancient wadi that are much larger than could be created by the rare floods that occur today, show that rivers once flowed continuously. These channels can be traced for hundreds of kilometers, their courses mapped by satellite imagery, their sediments dated to the Green Sahara period. In some places, there are tufa deposits, calcium carbonate precipitated from spring water, indicating that springs were active where now there's no water. There are travertine terraces, similar deposits formed by waterfalls and cascades. There are beach ridges and wave-cut cliffs formed by lake wave, now stranded far from any water. Archaeological evidence provides another line of support. The distribution of archaeological sites tracks the changes in environment. During the Green Sahara, sites are found throughout the region, near lakeshore, along river valley, in the highland. After the drying, sites are confined to oases, to the Nile Valley, to the margins of the desert. The artifacts found at the site also reflect the environment. Harpoons and fishhooks at sites near ancient lakes pottery and grinding stones at pastoral sites. Different tool types adapted to different subsistence strategies. Human skeletal remains from cemeteries in the Green Sahara can be analyzed for diet through stable isotope analysis of bone collagen. The isotope ratios tell us what people ate, whether they relied on terrestrial or aquatic resources, whether they ate wild or domestic animals, whether they consumed C3 plants like trees and shrubs or C4 plants like tropical grasses. These dietary signatures change through time, reflecting changes in subsistence strategies as the environment changed. Animal bones from archaeological sites tell a similar story. During the wet period, the bones are from aquatic species, fish and crocodiles and hippos, and from savanna mammals, antelope and cattle and gazelles. During the dry period, the bones are increasingly from desert-adapted species, camels and desert gazelles, or from domestic animals that can be watered at oases. Even the modern landscape, the current desert, contains clues. The distribution of plant and animal species reflects past connections. Some species now found only in isolated oases or mountains are relics, survivors from the Green Sahara that persisted in refugia when the desert returned. Their presence proves that the environment was once different, that these species once had continuous distributions across territory that is now impassable desert. Genetic studies of these relict populations show patterns consistent with isolation following the drying. Populations that were once connected became isolated, stopped exchanging genes, diverged genetically. By analyzing the genetic differences and using molecular clock methods, scientists can estimate when the populations became isolated, and the dates match the timing of the Saharan desiccation. Climate models, computer simulations of Earth's climate system, provide another line of evidence. When scientists input the orbital parameters for 10,000 or 8,000 years ago, when the northern hemisphere received more summer insolation than today, and run the models forward, they produce increased monsoon rainfall over North Africa, greening of the Sahara, formation of lakes. The models aren't perfect. They tend to underestimate the extent of the greening compared to what the geological evidence shows, but they confirm that the orbital changes were sufficient to drive the observed climate shift. All of these lines of evidence from multiple disciplines using multiple methods converge on the same conclusion. The Sahara was green from roughly 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, supporting lakes, rivers, grasslands, and abundant wildlife and human population. The evidence is overwhelming, consistent, detailed. We can not only say that it happened, but can describe what it was like, can map the extent of the lakes, can identify the species of animals and plants, can track the changes through time, can understand the mechanisms that drove the greening and the drying. Part 7. Walking in the Green Sahara. Let's return one more time to the Green Sahara, not to study it, but to experience it, to walk through it, to feel what it was like. Imagine yourself there, perhaps 8,000 years ago, during the wettest phase of the African humid period, in a place that is now deep in the desert, perhaps the Tenere region of Niger, or the Fezzan of Libya. You're standing on a low rise, a gentle hill overlooking a landscape that stretches to the horizon in every direction. The sun is climbing in the east, the morning still cool, the air fresh and slightly humid. Below you, spreading to the north and west, is a lake, its surface calm and reflecting the pale blue of the early morning sky. The lake is enormous, so large you can't see the far shore, water extending to the horizon, merging with the sky in a hazy line. The shore is perhaps a kilometer away, and between you and the water is a mosaic of grassland and scattered trees. The grass is green, thick, covering the ground almost completely, dotted with wildflowers, yellow and white and pink. The trees are acacias, their flat-topped crowns distinctive, their fine leaves creating dappled shade. Some trees stand alone, others cluster in small groves. They're not big trees, not forest giants, but they're substantial. Their trunks thick enough to lean against, their shade deep and cool. There are paths through the grass, trails worn by animals moving between the water and the higher ground. Some paths are narrow, made by small animals, antelopes perhaps. Others are wide, almost roads, trampled by large animals, elephants or buffalo, their weight compressing the soil, creating routes that remain visible long after the herd has passed. The sound is rich, layered. The grass rustles in the light breeze, a soft whisper. Birds call from the trees, species you might recognize if you knew the birds of modern East African savanna: hornbill, roller, shrike, weaver. Their calls are distinctive, some melodious, some harsh, creating a soundscape that is never quite silent. From the lake comes the sound of waterfowl, geese, and duck, their honking and quacking carrying across the water, and every so often the deep bellow of a hippo, a sound that rumbles in your chest, announcing the presence of these massive animals wallowing in the shallow. You walk down the hill toward the lake, following one of the animal tracks. The grass brushes against your leg, leaving them damp dew. Grasshoppers and butterflies rise from the vegetation as you fluttering away, settling back down behind you. The soil beneath your feet is dark, rich, nothing like the pale sand and stone of the modern desert. This is soil built up over thousands of years, plant growth and decay, supported by regular rainfall, by the slow work of decomposers, by the cycling of nutrients. As you approach the trees, you see signs of animals everywhere. Elephant dung, large fibrous masses, partially digested vegetation scattered along the trail, tracks in the soft ground near a mud wallow, the round impressions of elephant, the sharp cloven tracks of antelope, the large pad marks of a big cat, perhaps a lion, fresh tracks made this morning or last night, the animals moving through this landscape just as you are. You pass under an acacia, its branches spreading wide, and startle a troop of guinea fowl that were sheltering beneath it. They explode into motion, running and flapping and calling in alarm, disappearing into the grass. The disturbance attracts attention from above. A martial eagle, perched in the tree, turns its head to watch you, its eyes intense, assessing. It decides you're not a threat and returns to scanning the ground for prey. The trail leads to the lakeshore, and as you emerge from the grass onto the beach, the vista opens up. The lake stretches before you, vast and blue, its surface broken by the heads and backs of hippos, dozens of them wallowing in the shallow water near shore. They're large and brown, their skin wet and shining, their ears flicking to discourage flies. One yawns, revealing enormous teeth, a display of power, a warning. You keep your distance. Hippos are dangerous, aggressive when provoked, responsible for more human deaths than any other large animal in Africa. Beyond the hippos, the water deepens, darkens. There are birds out there, cormorants diving for fish, herons wading in the shallows, egrets stalking the mudflat. A crocodile lies on a sandbar, its jaws open, basking, warming itself in the strengthening sun. It's large, perhaps 4 meters long, ancient and patient, one of the apex predators of the lake. The beach is a mix of sand and mud, littered with shells, small mollusks that lived in the lake and were washed ashore. There are fish bones too, the remains of meals, perhaps brought here by otters or by human fishermen. The sand shows tracks from this morning, plovers and sandpipers, small birds that feed along the water's edge, a monitor lizard, its dragging tail leaving a distinctive trail, and human footprint, bare feet, recent, leading north along the shore. You follow the human track, curious. After a few hundred meters, you see smoke rising, a thin column against the sky, a camp. As you approach, dogs begin to bark, alerting the inhabitants. You call out a greeting, and figures emerge from the camp, shading their eyes to see who approaches. There are perhaps 20 people here, a family group or small band, living in simple shelter made from branches covered with hides and woven grass. Cattle are corralled nearby, a dozen or so, their presence indicated by lowing and the smell of dung. The cattle are African aurochs ancestors, smaller than modern domestic cattle, but recognizable, with long horns and dark coat. The people are friendly, welcoming, gesturing for you to sit. They're tall, lean, their skin dark, their features variable, showing the diversity of human population. They wear simple clothing, leather loincloths or wrapped, decorated with beads made from ostrich eggshell, from shell, from stone. Some have ochre designs painted on their skin, decorative or perhaps meaningful in ways you don't understand. They offer food, milk from the cattle, fresh and still warm, slightly sour, dried fish, caught in the lake and preserved in the sun, a porridge made from wild grain, ground on stone and boiled. You eat, sitting in the shade of a shelter, watching. The camp's activities. Children play near the water, supervised by older siblings. Women are working hides, scraping them clean, preparing them for use as clothing or shelter material. Men are repairing fishing equipment, nets, and harpoons, preparing for an evening expedition. The conversation, if you could understand it, would be about practical things, where the fishing is good, where the cattle can find fresh grazing, whether to move camp soon or stay a bit longer, news of other groups met recently, stories of encounters with dangerous animals, plans for the coming dry season. But it would also include things that transcend practicality, stories, myths, songs, laughter, the social bonding that makes human groups function, that creates culture. After resting and eating, you continue north along the lakeshore. The morning is advancing, the sun climbing higher, the temperature rising, but not oppressive. There's enough humidity that the heat is moderated, enough breeze coming off the lake that it's comfortable. You walk for hours, the landscape varying, but remaining fundamentally the same. Grassland to your right, rising gradually to low hills in the distance. Lake to your left, sometimes with beaches, sometimes with reed beds, sometimes with rocky shores where the ground comes right to the water. You see animals constantly. A herd of gazelles grazing on a hillside, their tan coats blending with the dried grass. A group of giraffes browsing acacias, their long necks allowing them to reach leaves high in the canopy. Elephants in the distance, a family group with several young, moving slowly through the grassland. The adults using their trunks to pull up grass, the young ones playing, chasing each other, tumbling. You see birds everywhere, raptors soaring on thermals, eagles and hawks and vultures, water birds on the lake, pelicans and flamingos and ducks, ground birds in the grass, bustards and francolin. The diversity is extraordinary. Dozens of species visible in a single day's walk. You see signs of predators, but not the predators themselves, which are cautious, hunting mostly at dawn and dusk, resting during the heat of the day. Scat on a trail, full of bone fragments and hair, hyena or lion, claw marks on a tree trunk, leopard sharpening its claws. A kill site, the remains of an antelope, mostly consumed, but with enough left to indicate what happened. The scatter pattern of bones indicating which predator was responsible. By midday, the sun is high and hot, and you find shade near a large acacia, settling down to rest through the hottest hours as the animals do. The air shimmers with heat over the grassland. The lake reflects the sun, too bright to look at directly. Sound diminishes, the birds quieting, the animals resting, only the insects maintaining their buzzing, their chirping, their constant background hum. As you rest, you reflect on what you've seen, on the abundance, the diversity, the life. This landscape supports all of this. Supports the humans and the cattle and the wild animals and the countless smaller creatures you haven't seen. The insects and rodents and reptiles and amphibian, all interconnected in food webs, all dependent on the water, on the grass, on the regular rhythm of the season. This is a functioning ecosystem, stable for thousands of years now, maintained by the monsoon, by the orbital configuration that brings the rains north every summer. It's productive, rich, capable of supporting substantial populations of large animals. It's not paradise. There's danger here, competition, predation, disease, the constant challenges of survival. But it's habitable, sustainable, alive, and it will not last. You can't know this. Standing here 8,000 years ago, you can't know that the Earth's orbit is slowly changing, that the northern hemisphere summers are gradually receiving less solar radiation, that the monsoon will weaken, that the rains will fail. You can't know that the lake you're sitting beside will dry up, that the grass will die, that the animals will leave or perish, that the humans will be forced to move away. But we know, looking back across those 8,000 years, we know what came next. And there's a poignancy in that knowledge, a sadness in knowing that this green world was temporary, was borrowed time, was a brief interlude between longer periods of desert. Part 8. Lessons from the Green Sahara. The story of the Green Sahara is not just a story about the past. It's a story about change, about how environments transform, about how what seems permanent is actually temporary, about how the planet's climate responds to forces operating on timescales, both longer and shorter than human perception naturally encompasses. What can we learn from this story? What does it tell us that's relevant to our own time, to the environmental challenges we face, to the future we're creating? First, it teaches us about the pace and magnitude of climate change. The greening of the Sahara happened relatively quickly, within a few centuries at most, perhaps faster in some areas. The drying happened even fast, within perhaps 1,000 years, maybe less. These are not geological timescales, not millions of years. These are timescales that humans can perceive, that fall within the span of civilization, that can affect multiple generations of a single culture. The people who lived in the Green Sahara experienced real, dramatic climate change. The conditions changed noticeably within lifetime. Elders could remember when the lakes were higher, when the rains were more reliable. Stories could be passed down about better time, wetter time, and eventually communities had to make hard decisions about whether to stay and adapt or to leave. This is not hypothetical or abstract. This is a real historical example of rapid climate change affecting human society, and it happened naturally, driven by orbital changes, not by human activity. It shows that climate can change quickly, dramatically, that environments we think of as stable or permanent can transform within human timescales. Second, it teaches us about thresholds and tipping points. The drying of the Sahara wasn't perfectly gradual, wasn't a smooth linear trend. Instead, the evidence suggests it happened in stages, with relatively stable periods interspersed with rapid shifts. Some researchers have proposed that there were tipping points, thresholds beyond which the system shifted to a new state quickly. One proposed mechanism involves vegetation feedback. When vegetation covers the ground, it affects the local climate by changing the albedo. Darker vegetation absorbs more sunlight than bare sand, warming the surface. By recycling moisture through evapotranspiration and by affecting dust emission, vegetation stabilizes soil and reduces dust, and dust affects climate by scattering sunlight and affecting cloud formation. As the monsoon weakened and vegetation began to die back, these feedbacks reinforced the drying. Less vegetation meant higher albedo, less evapotranspiration, more dust, all of which further reduced rainfall. Once enough vegetation was lost, the system crossed a threshold, and the drying accelerated, becoming self-reinforcing. The grassland state was no longer stable, and the system flipped to the desert state relatively quickly. This idea of tipping points is relevant to understanding modern climate change. Many components of the climate system, from ice sheets to ocean circulation to tropical forests, may have tipping points beyond which rapid, irreversible change occurs. Understanding where these thresholds are, what drives them, what their consequences would be, is crucial for predicting and managing future climate change. Third, the Green Sahara teaches us about human adaptability and vulnerability. The pastoral peoples of the Green Sahara were well adapted to their environment. They had developed successful strategies for exploiting the grassland, for managing their cattle, for moving seasonally, for maintaining their cultures. But when the environment changed, when the fundamental resources they depended on, water and grass, became scarce, they had to change too. Some adapted, shifting to camels, concentrating in oases, becoming true desert nomads. Others moved, migrating to regions where the climate remained suitable for their pastoral lifestyle. Others perhaps settled, abandoned pastoralism, adopted agriculture where water was available, and some undoubtedly suffered, struggled, failed to adapt quickly enough, and their communities declined or disappeared. This is a pattern that has repeated throughout human history. Humans are adaptable, capable of living in almost every environment on Earth, but that adaptability has limits. When environments change faster than societies can adapt, when the resources that supported a population disappear or decline, people suffer. Migration, conflict, collapse. These are responses to environmental change that we see repeated across history and across the world, and this is relevant now. We're causing environmental changes through greenhouse gas emissions, through land use change, through resource extraction that are affecting climate, ecosystems, water availability, agricultural productivity. These changes will affect billions of people, will force adaptation, will cause migration, will create conflicts. Understanding how past societies responded to environmental change, what strategies worked and what didn't, what the human costs were, can help us prepare for the changes we're creating. Fourth, the Green Sahara reminds us of the importance of long-term thinking. The greening lasted 6,000 years. That's longer than all of recorded history. That's longer than civilization has existed in its current form. To the people living in the Green Sahara, it must have seemed permanent, eternal, the way things had always been and would always be. But it wasn't permanent. It was a phase, a moment in the longer cycle of Earth's orbital changes. And when it ended, when the desert returned, the places that had been home to thousands of years of human occupation became uninhabitable. We face a similar challenge today. The climate we've known, the relatively stable Holocene climate that has existed for the past 11,000 years, the climate that allowed agriculture and civilization to develop, might seem permanent to us, but it's not. We're changing it, and the changes we're making now will persist for centuries, for millennia, far beyond the lifetime of any individual, any generation, any current nation, or civilization. The decisions we make in the next few decades about emissions, about land use, about how we organize our societies and economies will determine what kind of planet we leave to the future, what kind of climate our descendants will experience, what challenges they'll face. The Green Sahara teaches us that environments can change profoundly, that what seems stable isn't, that we need to think beyond the immediate, beyond the next election cycle or fiscal quarter, and consider the long-term consequences of our action. Fifth, and perhaps most fundamentally, the Green Sahara teaches us humility. Nature is powerful, dynamic, indifferent to human wishes and plans. The monsoon didn't care that people had built lives in the Green Sahara. that they had established communities, that they had created art and culture. When the orbital configuration changed and the monsoon weakened, the rain stopped and the people had to leave or adapt or die. We can't control the monsoon, can't dictate where the rain falls or doesn't fall. We can't stop the slow cycles of Earth's orbit, can't prevent the natural climate changes that operate on timescales of thousands of years. We're part of a larger system, subject to forces beyond our control, living on a planet that has its own dynamics, its own rhythms, its own history that extends billions of years before us and will continue billions of years after us. But we can affect that system, and we are affecting it more profoundly than any species in Earth's history, except perhaps the cyanobacteria that first produced oxygen billions of years ago. Our actions have consequences that echo across the planet, across time, that will be felt by generations yet unborn. And that realization should inspire both humility and responsibility. We're not masters of nature, not controllers of the planet, but we are participants, actors, agents of change. And we have choices about what kind of changes we cause, what kind of world we create, what kind of legacy we leave. Part 9, the future. Will the Sahara green again? Looking forward, will the Sahara green again? Will the cycle repeat? Will the monsoon strengthen? Will the rains return? The answer, based on orbital mechanics, is yes, eventually. Earth's orbit will continue its slow cycles, and in about 10,000 to 15,000 years, the northern hemisphere will again be configured to receive more summer solar radiation, the monsoon will strengthen, and the Sahara will likely green again. This is natural, predictable, based on the same forces that have driven past greening events. But there's a complication: human-caused climate change. We're adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere at a rate unprecedented in at least the past several million years. We're changing the global average temperature. We're altering precipitation patterns. We're affecting the very systems that control monsoons and regional climate. How will human-caused climate change interact with the natural orbital cycle? Will it enhance the next greening, making the Sahara even wetter than it was during the last African humid period? Will it suppress the greening, preventing the monsoon from strengthening as much as it otherwise would? Will it shift the timing, causing the greening to happen earlier or later than orbital mechanics alone would predict? These are open questions, subjects of ongoing research. Climate models give different answers depending on their assumption, their resolution, their representation of feedback processes. Some models suggest that increased greenhouse gases will strengthen the African monsoon, bringing more rain to the Sahel and perhaps allowing some greening of the southern Sahara. Other models suggest more complex pattern, with some regions getting wetter and others staying dry or getting drier. What we can say with more certainty is that the timescales are different. The natural greening, driven by orbital changes, would occur over thousands of years. Human-caused climate change is happening over decades to centuries. The two processes operate at different speeds, and their interaction is difficult to predict. There's also the question of whether humans might deliberately try to green the Sahara. Various proposals have been made over the decade. Massive tree planting projects, creating artificial lakes, pumping seawater inland to increase humidity, covering areas with reflective materials to change albedo. These geoengineering schemes range from plausible to fantastical, from small-scale experiments to continent-spanning mega-projects. Some limited greening projects are already underway. In the Sahel, the semi-arid transition zone at the Sahara's southern edge, farmers have been practicing farmer-managed natural regeneration, protecting and nurturing native trees and shrubs, allowing degraded land to recover. This has been successful in places, increasing tree cover, improving soil, providing shade and fodder for animals, creating windbreaks that reduce erosion. There's also the Great Green Wall Initiative, an ambitious African-led project to create a mosaic of green and productive landscapes across the width of Africa, from Senegal to Djibouti, along the Sahel. The goal is not to stop desertification through a literal wall of trees, but to restore degraded land, to help communities adapt to climate change, to create sustainable livelihoods that reduce pressure on fragile ecosystems. These projects are laudable, practical, focused on helping people and ecosystems adapt to current conditions. But they're not attempting to recreate the Green Sahara, not trying to transform the entire desert back into grassland. That would be beyond current human capability, would require interventions on a scale we can't yet achieve. and might have unintended consequences we can't predict. The Sahara will change in the future. Climate change will affect it, though exactly how remains uncertain. Human activities around its margins will affect it, and eventually, thousands of years from now, orbital mechanics will bring conditions favorable for greening again. But whether that greening happens, whether it looks like the last one, whether humans will witness it or be around to witness it, these are questions we can't yet answer. What we can do is learn from the past, understand how the Sahara has changed before, what drove those changes, what the consequences were for ecosystems and for human society. We can use that knowledge to better understand the present, to predict the future, to make wiser decisions about how we interact with our environment. Part X, the memory in the sand. There's something profound about standing in the Sahara today, in the emptiness and heat and silence, and knowing what lies beneath. Knowing that under your feet, buried under meters or tens of meters of sand, are the sediments of ancient lakes, the soils of ancient grassland, the artifacts of ancient people. The desert is not just empty space. It's a palimpsest, layers of history, written one over another, most of it hidden, forgotten, waiting to be discovered. When you look at a sand dune in the Sahara, that dune might be resting on lake sediments from the African humid period. The sand is recent, geologically speaking, mobilized when vegetation died and no longer held it in place. But the foundation is older, preserves an older story, a wetter story. When now you walk across a gravel plain, you might be walking across the bed of an ancient river. Its channel filled and buried, but still there, detectable with the right instruments, mapping technology, careful observation. The rocks scattered across the surface might have been transported by that river when it flowed, deposited when the current slowed, left behind when the water dried up. When you climb a mountain in the Sahara, a massif rising from the plains, you might find rock art on its flanks, images painted or carved thousands of years ago by people who climbed the same mountain, who looked out over a landscape that was green, who saw animals that no longer exist here, who lived lives we can only imagine. The art is weathering, fading. The rock face itself is slowly eroding, flaking away, taking the images with it. In another few thousand years, much of the art will be gone, destroyed by the same processes that are slowly wearing down the mountains themselves. But for now, it remains a direct connection to the past, a message from people who are long dead to anyone who takes the time to look, to see, to wonder. And there are still discoveries being made. Archaeological surveys using satellite imagery, using remote sensing technologies that can detect buried structures and ancient watercourses, are finding sites that were unknown, that have never been excavated. These sites contain artifacts, human remains, evidence of how people lived, what they ate, how they adapted to the changing environment. Each new discovery adds detail to the story, fills in gaps in our understanding, answers some questions, and raises new ones. We know more about the Green Sahara now than we did 20 years ago, and we'll know more 20 years from now than we do today. The story is not finished, not complete. It's still being written by researchers working in the field, in the lab, in front of computers running climate models and analyzing data. But even with all that we know, with all the data and analysis and understanding, there's something that remains elusive, something that can't be fully captured in scientific papers and dry recitations of fact. The lived experience of the people who inhabited the Green Sahara, who walked beside the lake, who herded their cattle, who painted the rock art, who watched the rains come and go, who eventually watched those rains fail and had to make impossible choices about their future. We can reconstruct their material culture, can catalog their tools and pottery and ornament. We can analyze their diet, can determine what they ate, what proportions came from different sources. We can map their settlement, can understand their migration pattern, but we can't fully access their thought, their belief, their fear, their hope. We can't hear their song or understand their story, except in the most fragmentary, indirect way. What did they think as they watched the lakes shrink year by year as the reliable rains became unreliable, as the grasslands dried and turned brown? Did they understand what was happening, that the climate was changing, that the world they knew was ending? Did they remember stories from their elders about a time when it was even wetter, even greener? Did they hope that the rains would return, that this was just a bad stretch that would end eventually? Or did they accept the changes as inevitable, as the way of the world, as something beyond human understanding or control? Did they see it as the will of gods or spirits, as punishment for some transgression, as a natural cycle that had happened before and would happen again? We don't know. We can speculate, can draw analogies to other societies facing environmental change, can extrapolate from what we know about human psychology and how people respond to crisis. But we can't know for certain. The interiority, the subjective experience of those ancient people is lost, gone forever, beyond the reach of archaeology or any other science. And yet, in a way, we can connect to them because we're facing our own environmental changes, our own climate crisis, our own hard choices about how to respond to a world that's changing faster than our institutions and cultures can easily adapt to. The specifics are different. We're causing the changes rather than experiencing natural ones. We have scientific understanding of the mechanism. We have technologies they didn't have, but the fundamental human experience of living through environmental transformation, of uncertainty about the future, of having to adapt or move or accept loss, that's universal. That connects us across the millennia. The Green Sahara is a mirror, showing us both what we were and what we might become. It shows us human resilience, the ability to adapt to challenging environments, to create cultures and community, even in places that seem harsh by modern standards. But it also shows us human vulnerability, the dependence on environmental conditions that are beyond our control, the fragility of the systems we build when those conditions change. Part D, the cycle continues. The earth doesn't stop turning. Time doesn't pause. The great cycles that drove the greening and drying of the Sahara continue, indifferent to human observation, human concern, human existence. The planet orbits the sun, its axis slowly precessing, its orbital eccentricity varying, all according to the laws of physics and the gravitational dance of the solar system. Somewhere in the future, thousands of years from now, the conditions will align again. Northern hemisphere summers will receive more solar radiation. The temperature gradient between land and ocean will strengthen. The monsoon will push northward, and the Sahara will begin to green again. Perhaps humans will still be around to see it. Perhaps our descendants, if we have descendants, will watch with scientific instruments and predictive models as the first rains begin to fall more regularly on the desert. Perhaps they'll document the greening. We'll track the northward spread of vegetation. We'll watch lakes fill and rivers flow. Perhaps they'll be able to predict exactly when and where the changes will occur. We'll have models accurate enough to forecast decades or centuries in advance. Or perhaps humans will be gone by then, extinct or evolved into something we wouldn't recognize, our cities buried or eroded away, our artifacts scattered and weathered, our mark on the planet fading like the rock art of the Green Sahara peoples. And the earth will continue its cycles without us. The Sahara will green and dry and green again, and no one will be there to witness it, to record it, to find it significant. Either way, the planet endures, the cycles continue. The Sahara is not permanently desert any more than it was permanently green. It oscillates. It changes. It responds to forces operating on timescales longer than human lifetime, longer than civilization, but shorter than geological epochs, shorter than the lifetime of mountain ranges or oceans. There's something both humbling and comforting in this perspective. Humbling because it reminds us that we're temporary, that our mark on the earth, however profound it seems to us, is ultimately erasable, subject to the same forces of erosion and burial and transformation that have erased so much of the past, but comforting because it suggests that the planet is resilient, that it has weathered changes before, that it will continue, that life will persist even if we don't. The Sahara has been many things. Ocean floor. When this land was beneath ancient seas hundreds of millions of years ago, savanna during wet period, desert during dry period, it will be other things in the future, will transform again and again as the earth continues its journey through time. Our moment, our brief overlap with this particular configuration of climate and landscape is just that, a moment, a fleeting intersection of human time and geological time. But it's our moment. We're here now. We get to witness this version of the Sahara, this desert phase, and we get to know about the green phase that preceded it. And that knowledge connects us to deep time, to the long story of the planet, to the understanding that what is not what was and will not be what will be. Closing, resting in deep time. As we come to the end of this journey, as we step back from the Green Sahara and return to the present, to the comfort of wherever you're listening from, let's carry with us some of what we've learned, some of what we've felt. The Sahara was green. This is not speculation or imagination. It's fact. established through multiple lines of evidence, documented in sediments and fossils and artifact and art. Real people lived there. Real animals grazed there. Real rain fell there. It was a place of life, of movement, of change, and then it wasn't. The rains failed, the desert returned, the people moved away, and the sand covered what had been, burying it, preserving it, hiding it from view, but not destroying it, not erasing it completely. This story of transformation, of greening and drying, of abundance and emptiness, plays out on timescales that we can perceive but barely comprehend. 6,000 years of green, a few thousand years of transition, 5,000 years of desert and counting. These are not abstract numbers. They're periods of time during which real changes unfolded, during which real consequences played out for real organisms, real ecosystem, real human community. And the story teaches us things we need to know now, in our own moment of environmental transformation. It teaches us that change is real, that environments we think of as permanent are actually temporary, that what seems stable can shift. It teaches us that there are thresholds, tipping points, beyond which change accelerates and becomes difficult or impossible to reverse. It teaches us that humans are both adaptable and vulnerable, capable of thriving in challenging conditions, but dependent on resources that can disappear when climate change. Most of all, it teaches us humility. We're part of something larger than ourselves, larger than our civilization, larger than our species. We're participants in Earth's long story, actors on a stage that existed billions of years before us and will exist billions of years after. Our moment matters. It matters profoundly, but it's still just a moment in deep time. So as you drift towards sleep, as your thoughts slow and soften, as the boundaries between waking and dreaming blur, let yourself rest in that knowledge. Let yourself feel connected to the ancient peoples who painted the rock art, who herded their cattle beside vast lakes, who watched the world change around them and adapted as best they could. Let yourself feel connected to the planet itself, to its rhythms and cycles, to the slow, patient turning of seasons and centuries and millennia. You are here now, in this moment, in this climate, on this earth. You are a part of the continuing story, a link in the unbroken chain of life that stretches back to the first cells and forward to futures we cannot imagine. You are temporary, yes, but you are real. Your moment matters. Your choices have consequences. The Sahara was green. It will be green again. Between these green periods lie desert, long stretches of aridity, emptiness, harsh beauty. We're living in one of those desert periods now, both literally in the Sahara and metaphorically in our relationship with the planet, in a time when abundance seems distant, when the future is uncertain, when we're not sure what comes next. But the rains will return. Maybe not in our lifetime, maybe not for thousands of years, but they will return. The cycles continue. The earth endures, and life, patient and resilient and endlessly creative, persists, adapts, finds ways forward even through the harshest conditions. Rest in that knowledge. Rest in the understanding that you're part of something vast and ancient and ongoing. Rest in the comfort that comes from seeing yourself not as separate from nature, but as embedded within it, as one expression of the planet's creativity, as one moment in the long story of Earth's becoming. The Green Sahara is gone, buried beneath the sand, preserved in sediments and memories and stories we tell. But it was real, and in being real, in having existed, in having supported life and beauty and human communities, it proves that change is possible, that transformation happens, that what is today is not what must be tomorrow. Sleep well, child of the changing world. Witness to transformations, both ancient and modern. Dream of green grass growing where now there is only sand, of rains returning after long drought, of life persisting through harsh season, of patience rewarded across timescales that dwarf human comprehension. And know that you are part of this story, this long experiment in life on a restless planet, this continuing narrative of change and adaptation and survival. From all of us at Earth's history, thank you for joining this journey into the Green Sahara, into a world that existed just yesterday in geological time, but seems like a distant dream in human time. If this brought you peace, if it helped you see change as part of the natural order, as something to understand rather than fear, please share it with someone who might need that perspective. Until next time, rest well. The desert remembers the rain, the sand remembers the grass, and the earth, patient and eternal, continues its cycle, indifferent to our wishes, but not untouched by our action, waiting to see what we will do with our moment, our brief but consequential time in its long, long story. Good night.